Hello, welcome again. Now we're going for Kris Buytaert, and he's speaking on 7 tools for your desktop stack.
No, DevOps stack.
De
Different topic.
Very different topic, yeah. Sorry for that. Just a little bit entertaining at the start of the speech.
Yeah, 7 tools for your desktop stack. I wonder what an open source data center conference would do with it, but I deal with Firefox and, well, that's it. So, 7 tools for your DevOps stack. Something totally different. Let me first introduce myself. I'm Kris. I'm from Belgium. About 10 to 15 years ago, when I started my career, I used to be a software developer. I did stuff in all kinds of weird languages, some Java, some Perl, some PHP, even some proprietary Oracle stuff. And I was always the guy who was putting these things in production. I was always the guy who was putting up the web servers, putting up the database servers, and deploying this stuff, making sure it kept running. So I basically became an operations person out of necessity. Today, my role is basically the guy who teases his juniors and teases his colleagues to be better at their job, to find new challenges and to solve different problems. And, well, that's what I like to do, solving problems and playing with new stuff. My blog is titled Everything is a Fucking DNS Problem. You might remember from that. And, well, for the past couple of years, I've been doing everything regarding high performance computing, large-scale deployment, configuration management, automation, all that stuff. So building virtual environments even before there was a bookstore calling it the cloud. So the thing I mostly try to do is being good at my job. So this talk is 7 tools for your DevOps stack. Let's figure out what's this DevOps thing anyhow. So over the past decade, I've been talking and going to a lot of conferences. I was meeting people, talking to people, and trying to figure out how to deploy software, how to keep it running, and how to scale it, and how to make it performant. And I was constantly running into a group of people which constantly was encountering themselves, were Patrick, Gildas, there was Jess Humble, there was Julian, Luke, so some other people, and we were discussing how to do this. How do you deploy software? How do you manage uptime? How do you deal with performance? How do you deal with failure? And in the States, there was a conference called Velocity, and there were some other events going on. And suddenly, Patrick and I, we figured out, look, there's something missing in Europe. There's no real event where these people, both development people and operations people, talk together. And that's how DevOps Days started. So DevOps Days, first edition in Ghent, almost 3 years ago, was a small conference, I think probably as big as this one, but the format was different. It was in the morning a couple of formal talks, in the afternoon we had open spaces. In the open spaces were people talking about their experience, how they did configuration management, how they did performance tuning, how they scaled their file systems. And it was actual people with real problems, with real solutions, and with real experiences, talking to each other, experiencing and sharing their experiences. So that one event kicked off. There were people from all over the world. We had some weirdos flying in from Atlanta and from Australia to a small event in Ghent. And after that, we had a bunch of other conferences, and, well, all over the world. So it's a growing movement where people are discussing the problems when you deploy software. It's definitely not something where we know all the answers yet. We're still trying to look and find out better solutions and find out how to do things different. But we're trying to talk to as much as people as possible and trying to convince people that there's a need for development and operations people to talk and to discuss their problems together. So we've been reaching out to different communities, like the Java people, the PHP people. There's a going trend where different conferences, different technology conferences, are actually organizing a dedicated track on DevOps, on integrating development and operations in their conference. For example, DrupalCon in Munich this year, they'll have a full track focused on DevOps, figuring out how you can clearly, correctly perform and deploy Drupal instances, stuff like that. So This thing definitely isn't new. I mean, I've been doing the same line of work for the past 7 to 8 years, but the thing we have now is that there's a name. Now there is a common technology, a common word where we say, this is DevOps. So let's define this thing. Would you like to work like this? Who knows who wrote this beside Mark? Nobody? This piece of text is ancient. It's a summary of Deming's book Out of the Crisis, which he wrote in '86. And his research work was years and years before that, so it's definitely not new. When we were having, I actually had the same list of thingies printed out on a sheet, put in front of me in Mountain View, and we started discussing it. It was like, yeah, this all makes sense, this is DevOps, this is what we're doing. And then, basically, the cat came out of the corner and said, look, this is old, this is nothing new. And when you start thinking about it, DevOps is absolutely nothing new. So, a shorter definition is, like Adam Jacob tells us, it's a professional and cultural movement. But that still doesn't tell us anything. There's two people who thought about it and they were looking for a better definition, and that's Damon Edwards and John Willis, back then when they were working together on DTO solutions. And they basically defined DevOps as 4 things. It's about culture. How does an organization deal with failure? I think Christian made a really great talk this morning on how Booking.com deals with failure, how they bring along new colleagues, how do you work together as a team? Do you really have isolated silos where there's the ops guys, there's the developers, or do you work as a group? It's about automation, it's about being able to reproduce your environment, being able to redeploy, being able to rebuild everything you do, and being sure that every time you do it, it's going to be the same. And it's about measurement. What's going on in your infrastructure? How many failures do we have? How many users do we have? How many times a day do we deploy? How many memory usage is going on? What's the evolution in memory usage? All of that stuff, measuring it. But also measuring how many code changes there have been. And sharing those experiences. Sharing both the code you write, but also how do you deal with this? The example Christian was doing this morning, 10 years ago, I cannot imagine that an organization like Booking would be telling us how they do this, how they run operations. Today, it's common. So this culture thing, where do it come from? Who still works like this? I mean, developers and operations people fighting. Friday evening, 5 o'clock, here's a tarball, deploy it. See people, so it's still happening. Why? Well, we've not been the most friendly people to work with. We've been writing and reading books like this. How do you expect developers to deal with us if we just say, oh, you're running out of disk space, what's your username? We laugh at them. That's really not the way how you want to treat people. So what we really should do is start to play together. Start to have like small kids, when they grow up, first they play in a corner, their own toys, their own small pieces, but when they grow up, they actually start to play together and get along. Yes, we all like to play with the new fancy tools. Yes, our developers like to play with the new latest developing languages, and we want to play with the newest tools. But if we can do it together, it's going to be much more fun. It's going to be much easier to do. So, what tool would you use for that? Okay, so either everybody's asleep or you guys are really clueless. Nobody? This is my preferred tool for this. I get people together, we start drinking, we start talking, and you get communications going on between developers and operations, and people start sharing their experiences, they're sharing their pain, and you get problems solved. Because once you've been at the office at 10 o'clock in the morning with the guy sitting next to you with the same hangover, then you know what's working together. So, culture, automation. There's a bunch of solved problems out here. Well, none of these are really solved, but for the past 5 to 10 years we've been talking enough about them, so you probably should already be using them. You should be using some kind of automated deployment framework, whether it be Fight, Kickstart, whatever. By now you should be using any of the configuration management tools out there. Who is not using a configuration management tool yet? Okay. So we got to that point where people are using configuration management. Who's storing his config management in version control? Well, that's like 7 hands. What are the rest of you guys doing? 8? 9? Okay. So we're doing automated deployment, we're doing config management. For our development environments, we're doing build automation. So there's tools out there that can help us. There's plenty of tools out there, but there's going to be new challenges. The new challenges are how do you deal with those changes at scale? How do you tell a data center, or how do you tell your infrastructure, now do this upgrade but only in data center A, or do this upgrade but only on machines with a CPU generation from that year, or do it only on machines that have only less than 4 gigabytes of RAM. So you need to be able to instruct your machines on a different level than modifying a file somewhere and restarting a service. You need a tool like mCollective or Rundeck or Noah to actually orchestrate your infrastructure. And then another thing that's really coming up as a real problem is good repository management. There's a bunch of proprietary tools out there. Red Hat has its solution. They're trying to build it as open source, but they're still not succeeding in it. But there are other tools coming out like Pulp, combined with Sponge, and tools that make package management easier. So let's look a bit at mCollective. Who knows mCollective? Who's using it? Okay. So mCollective, although Ari doesn't like me saying it, best way to describe it is a distributed SSH on steroids. It's a tool that uses a queue. You throw a comment at the queue, and all the machines that are listening, they're going to execute, if they match the criteria, they're going to execute that comment, and they're going to give you feedback on what happened. So you can do stuff like query which version you have installed on your platform, figure out where a service is running, and then do regular expressions based on, like I said, which data center they're running in or whatever. If you're running Puppet and you just screwed your Puppet master, you need to re-sign all your certificates. You can do that with mCollective. You can just say, remove these, and these files, restart, stuff like that. So as an example, we had an environment where it was a testing environment, and development really didn't know anymore where they actually were running Apache. It was just a bunch of machines they were using, and it was like a couple of, well, I think 80 of them. This actually clearly shows you. And we needed to figure out where is Apache still running. Well, turned out it was running on the web server, was running on some DevTools site, and all the other boxes were stopped. So that was easy. And when you're talking with developers, especially Java developers, and when you're in an environment where there's been lots of wild grow, lots of people doing stuff on machines, you come to the situation where sometimes they've installed packages manually over and over and over again. And you start figuring out bugs where they've deployed an application on one application server, it works there, and on the next machine it doesn't work. Why? Because their Java versions are different. So mCollective is also easy to use the MC package plugin and figure out which GDKs you have deployed. And, well, that's a lot of different versions, right? This is actually a real-life situation where I had development coming in and they asked me, what versions are we running? And with this just one command line result, we could tell them look, there's way too many versions of them out there. How do we deal with this? And we could start a conversation on what's going wrong and why do they need these different versions. Turned out they really didn't need all these versions. It was just the latest available version they downloaded from the internet and installed. So getting these tools in use means you can start a conversation with your developers. GDKs are cleanly packaged. Their applications were not. They were just WAR files deployed. But they'll learn that, hang on, if we can use that tool to figure out and query on all our machines what versions are installed, maybe we should start packaging stuff. But packaging is hard. Who likes packaging? Is there anybody maintaining packages here? Upstream to distributions? How many times do you run into the fact that the version of the software you want in the distribution you're using is 3 years behind?
Very often.
Very often. Well, let's say constantly. You could choose for a bleeding edge distribution, or you could say, I'm going to package this yourself, but then you're in packaging hell again, because you need to package all the dependencies, and so on. So, if you want to contribute that stuff into a distribution, it's going to cost you a lot of more effort than your boss is probably willing to pay, because all he wants is having a software running. He doesn't care about having a distribution which has exactly the same version your developers want. So, if you're into RPM world, there's a huge book, Maximum RPM, which tells you how packaging works. But it is something that's needed. You want to package stuff. You want to be able to use all the features packaging gives you, like consistency and dependencies management and all that tools. And you want to package software your developers are building. So Jordan, the CISL, he was frustrated with that problem. And out of frustration, he started building a tool called FPM. So FPM basically takes a bunch of inputs, could be an RPM, could be a Ruby gem, could be a Debian package, could be a Python package. I think it currently also supports PHP packages, or just a directory or a bunch of files. And FPM eats that, and the output is going to be RPM, Debian package, Solaris package, whatever. It's really easy. It's just one command line, target, in this example, RPM, it's source the directory. I'm going to package Hornet Q here, this is the version, and this is the directory. And out comes a package which is usable. It's not a package which is going to be accepted in any upstream distribution, but it's going to solve your local problem. You can put this in your local repository, and you have a clean versioned package. So with FPM in mind, we were doing a lot of Ruby deployments, and we were constantly running into the point that none of the Ruby stuff is packaged cleanly. FPM allows me to package a Ruby tool really fast. So I set up a GitHub repository where basically I have a list of RPMs, some specified with a version, some not. And if you send me a pull request for that repository, our Jenkins instance will automatically pull the list in and run FPM over all the packages and the dependencies and push that into our repository. And then you have a free Ruby gem build service. And it's so trivial. It's like 2 or 3 lines of code, but it works. And if we run into a dependency at a customer or somewhere internally where we need another Ruby gem, it's just editing one file, and Jenkins will pick it up, or continuous integration framework will just build the new package we need. So, culture, some automation. Let's talk about measuring and monitoring. So John Vincent, Lucis on Twitter, he started a trend. It's actually a sub-movement of DevOps. You could call it like that, where he stated, look, monitoring sucks. We all like monitoring, but there's so many problems. I mean, if you want to have metrics and graphing and alerting, you need to collect your data once or twice or 3 times the same data in order to do something with it. There's still a way too fixed model of binding a host to a service. I mean, services float around, they're not fixed to a model. And most tools are not capable of dealing with that. There was a lot of open source tools around, and a couple of years we evaluated a bunch of them, and we came back to the conclusion that the only way to actually deploy monitoring tools at scale was to fall back to Nagios or one of his friends. Because Hyperic, Zabbix, Xenos, all of those didn't have a clean API, and if you were doing stuff at scale, you had no way to do configuration management of them. Today, Xenos and Zabbix, their APIs are getting better. You can actually configure them remotely, but it's still not at a point where stuff is really working. So, stuff isn't changing. Lots of people think monitoring sucks. Monitoring is way too complex. There's new tools coming out, but if you want to build a monitoring framework that really works, you need to build something like this. And that's chaos. I mean, you can collect your data, you can use Collectd, you can get some Nagios metrics, you can get some Puppet reports, you can parse your Apache logs, Java applications expose their stuff using GMX, and then you can mangle all that data with some tools using JMX trans or using Logster, and then throw that into tools that are going to display your data. But then you still want to do stuff on top of that. You want to parse that data and make, out of the data you have, you want to make information out of that. But if you have information, you need to build knowledge on top of that. So people start experimenting with these tools and they solve a couple of problems, but they don't solve everything. But there's one, in the monitoring sucks movement, there's one tool in the middle that comes back every time. It's Logstash. Logstash by default is a tool that allows you to do search on your centralized logs. There's other tools out there like Graylog2 and ELSA. But the idea that Logstash works with a queue, and you can throw anything at it, that makes it a really powerful tool. By default, you just ship your log files over the queue to the indexer. The indexer parses it and stores it by default in Elasticsearch, and you have a front end to query Elasticsearch. But you can also get it from other places. You can get it from Gelf, which is a Graylog extended format, or you can get XMPP data in there, or Twitter data, and then you can mangle all that data. You can put filters on top of that and throw that into, well, the default is Elasticsearch, but you can also throw all of the data into Ganglia, into Graphite, into StatsD, or into anything else. And that idea is an idea that's starting to become more popular, where people basically we want to have a bunch of small tools that can either generate data, throw it on a bus, and then we want to have a bunch of other tools that actually consume that data and start doing things with it. And then maybe, oops, other way, and then maybe we can clean this out and have clear, isolated parts where this is data collection, this is data mangling, this is actual data displaying, and the other parts are alerting and reporting. Where you come back to the initial Unix idea where small tools work together really great. So a default Logstash frontend, not really a pretty one, right? I hear a lot of people using Graylog2 on top of Logstash just because of the user interface of Logstash not being good. But there's another tool around, which is Kibana. And Kibana is just a lightweight PHP frontend for Logstash. It's just talking to the Elasticsearch backend. And it looks much nicer. And that brings us to, it's a really small application talking to an Elasticsearch backend. And that's something our developers also like. So they write a lot of log files. They spawn out Java stack traces in hundreds of megabytes a day. But they're not doing anything with that. Why? Because they're not really keen on parsing into log files. But if you give them a tool like Logstash with Elasticsearch-based backend, they get an API where they can actually query their data, the data they generated, and they can start learning from it. And you can start discussing with them, look, what's going on inside the application? Why are we generating so much logs, and what's inside the logs? And this is a tool that allows developers and operations people to talk about their log files, which is a really critical, important part. So you got some graphs on top here, but those are really not the ones you want. You want to have something really fancy to show to your management. You want to show them how many bookings you have per hour, how many people are actually logging onto the site and buying stuff. So there's another great tool out there, which is Graphite. Is anybody here currently using Cacti? Yeah, you guys are using Graphite, definitely. Cacti, anybody? How many DBAs do you need to manage the database of a big Cacti environment? So I've seen a bunch of Cacti setups that basically they were too big. The fact that you needed a dedicated database to manage it, because it was storing so many stuff there, that was a problem. Graphite takes that stuff away. It's making graphing really easy. Anything you can think of, which is a key value pair, is something you can graph. It's as easy as just echoing some string with some value with a timestamp to Netcat on your graphics host, to Netcat, and pipe that to port 2003 on your Graphite host, and you've got a graph. You do 2 of them, that's it. And it's so fun to play with. It's got an ugly web interface, just like Logstash, but it allows you to do multiple things with the graph. So you get a bunch of values, these are your metrics on the left, and you can then click to them and group them and sum them and average them and do some other calculations on top of them. And Graphite then will build this image for you. Now this image is actually a URL. So you can use an API to generate this image. And you can go to a developer and say, look, you know that data you wanted? You know the averages of the throughput time of that file when you were parsing that file and you were starting to write a timestamp, and then you write a timestamp again when you finish parsing that? Look, you can actually graph that, and you can actually build a dashboard yourself and make it visible to everybody. And you can start playing with this data. Here's the data. Here's an API. And developers will start playing with it because they love to see figures. They love to see what's going on inside their system. And now they can because they have the data and they can turn it into information. So there's a bunch of tools that are complementary to Graphite. StatsD, which allows you to send a metric and you send it values and it's going to do calculations on top of that. So if you want to know how many queries you do on a minute, each time you send the one to StatsD, it's going to add that, and then after a minute, it's going to flush it to Graphite. You can get default operating system metrics using tools like collectd. If you're a Java shop and you're looking at the Java statistics, messages queues in GMS or Java heap space, you can use a tool like GMX_trans and get all the GMX data out of the application and throw that to Graphite. Actually, GMX_trans also throws stuff into Ganglia. Or you can use tools like Logster and count the number of access logs, count your Tomcat logs, see how many 404 pages you get, parse your postfix logs, and graph them to Graphite. There's also a bunch of people that didn't like this kind of screens, and they started building their own dashboards because there's an API, so you can build new dashboards on top of that. There's Gdash, there's Tattle. Those other dashboards are around. There's a really huge ecosystem of new open source tools being built on top of all these tools. Tattle, for example, allows you to define thresholds, and when stuff happens, when you go beyond a certain threshold, which could be an average, or which could be the deviation of something, it allows you to send emails and do stuff like that. So, what about sharing stuff? These days, open source is all over the place. 5 to 10 years ago, when you were a system administrator and you wanted to contribute to an open source project, there was little else you could do besides writing bug reports, writing documentation, or explaining people about how it works. But these days, you can actually, lots of stuff is written in shell scripts, it's written in scripting languages which you can easily understand, or you can actually publish the code you use to deploy your software. You can publish your chef cookbooks, you can publish your Puppet manifests. Wikimedia published their whole Puppet tree. I wouldn't look at it because I call it the anti-pattern of how you should do it, but they did publish it. People can actually pull a patch request, send it to Wikimedia, and they might even apply to their infrastructure. Sharing is also talking about experiences. It's also the fact that more and more organizations and environments and conferences are tapping into open space formats. But when you're talking about development and operations working together, one of the biggest problems is that the environments where the developers are working in are not the same as the environments that you are deploying your software on. There's a lot of developers working on their local workstation. And when they build something, they ship it, they say, works for me, works on my machine. There's lots of environments where you have developers working on Windows, your test environments are some local machines, and your production setup is in a data center or on the cloud in a big farm with a totally different architecture. So you want to be able to share the way you build your infrastructure with your developer. You want to be able to share code because developers write applications. Applications have config files. Who's the owner of the config file? Could be a shared ownership you have. So tools are around to help us. I'm a big fan of using Vagrant. Vagrant is an abstraction layer to VirtualBox. When I was first using it, I was basically a Xen person. I was doing Xen all the way. I had my Puppet Masters and my Chef setups all in Xen, and I had one dedicated configuration management server. That was the one I worked on. I constantly launched the virtual machine, connecting to that configuration management server, applying my manifests. And it worked. But I was flooding my disk. I had not enough resources, and I always had the one server instance running, and it was being cluttered with different versions and different variants of installation profiles, and it really wasn't helping me. VirtualBox, well, wasn't really my favorite, but the advantages Vagrant gave me, the easiness of playing with a virtual machine, bringing it up and down, and not having to worry about all the other stuff, that's really the power. So if you're working with a development team, what we frequently have is a Git repository where there's a Vagrant file, a bunch of Puppet manifests, a bunch of submodules that are Puppet modules we're using, and then a bunch of submodules in Git which are the actual application code of the developers. So we check out one project which has both the description of our virtual machines, has both the code of the developers, and it has both the code of the people building the infrastructure. It's small, it's versionable, you can actually see who's changing what, it's a shared code base, it's something you can easily transfer and easily ship to different locations. The only thing you need on top of that is a big fat Vagrant box. Or, if you don't want to, you can provide them with the definition on how to build them themselves. Patrick Dubois wrote a tool called Viwi, which allows you to build a Vagrant box from a config file. So, sharing code, sharing your infrastructure becomes really easy now. If you look at a Vagrant file, basically a Vagrant file is a piece of Ruby code. Inside this config file, you can add additional Ruby code if you want. And this one example defines me that the base box I'm using is my second CentOS instance, because the first one was not really working. I define an IP address, I define a host name, I define where to find my Puppet modules, manifests, and I apply site.pp. And I actually have two machines inside that config file, so I can create a setup where there's a database server, an application server, there's multiple NoSQL instances, and bring it up all with one simple command. And it looks exactly like a developer would use in a real data center, because he needs 4 or 5 machines. So if you start from scratch, you do init, and it generates you an empty template. But as of that, you just do Vagrant up, and what it will do is it will boot the machine, it will provision it, and it runs all the Puppet manifests, or the Chef cookbooks, or the CF engine, or just shell scripts. And you get to a point where the developer is in exactly the same setup as you would be when you would deploy it in production. If he makes changes, if you make changes to your code base, you do it to Vagrant provision, and if at the end of the day you want to go home, you just do Vagrant down, and it's going to shut down a machine. If you don't want to work on a project for a couple of days, you just do destroy, and it's going to use no disk space at all. And if you're absolutely sure that you can already, if your code is in a state where it's working, you can do vagrant destroy every 5 minutes because your build box, your infrastructure is fully reproducible. You're fully capable of saying to a developer, look, you can destroy it if you broke it. It's going to be back in 2 minutes. There's use cases where not only developers were using this, not only operations people were using this, but actual salespeople just got the vagrant box definitions, one box, and they could take the full application on the road. And when they were demoing to customers, they just did vagrant up, and there was a full application they were selling. And if there was a new version of the application, the only thing they had to do was git fetch, and they had a new version, and it worked. And that's really powerful, because then you're really sharing across all departments of your organization, not just development, not just operations, but really all departments are seeing the benefits of tools like this. So what else do developers and operations people like to share?
Success.
Success, yeah. I was thinking about sushi, but... So, what's the biggest tool I actually forgot? Yes.
Testing. Make sure that actually stuff I deployed done with.
Yeah. I didn't specifically mention testing, but you could indeed. You need to do a lot of testing, obviously, definitely. And
Brain?
a brain? Yeah, a brain. The biggest tool I didn't cover is basically the human. We can use all the tools we want. We can build the most perfect solutions. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the people working together. It comes down to the operations people and the development people talking to each other and solving problems and creating value for an organization. It comes down to talking, not hiding in a corner, but working together. The brain, the human being, is the most important tool that's around. And all the other can just help us to point out things we already know. So I put up a bunch of links to all the tools I mentioned. On my GitHub repository, you can find vagrant boxes to install a bunch of them and play with them. I probably broke a couple of them, so you can send in patches if they don't work. And with that, I guess we're almost back on schedule. So if there's any questions?
I face that this is in theory very ideal, but in practice I often face that in a lot of organizations these parts are strictly separated. So when I talk to developers, I break internal rules. Because we are not using the hierarchy. Yeah? And
do you like where you're working?
do you want a real answer or?
You're hiring too, so.
No, I try to convince our developers to develop on the target platform. Mm-hmm. Still, I cannot convince them. They are used to work on their local PC since years, and they do not want to miss Notepad Plus and something like that. Yeah.
With Vagrant, they don't need to. They just
I know.
Their files are on the local file system.
Yeah, so
and there's other tools, by the way. I use Vagrant as a good example because I know it, but there's other tools out there.
And I say in 99% of all Java projects, we face problems with incompatible development platform and target platform.
Mm-hmm. So the experience I have after talking about this topic for a couple of years now is that we get more and more organizations that realize there's a problem. obviously there's always going to be organizations that are going to hide and going to say, no, there's not an issue. But we get feedback, we get questions from organizations that have figured out the problem is there. Sometimes they had to have an Apollo incident. Sometimes they really had to crash badly before they started realizing there was a problem.
Yeah.
But it's not a bottom-up movement anymore. It's actually C-level executives that call us in and say, look, our development and operations people, the work they're doing great work, but they need to work together. Can you please come in and help us? And once you get to that point, the ball starts rolling, and you'll figure out that the people like yourself, they want to work together. And then it's a matter of figuring out who wants to do what, putting them together on the same team, putting them together in the same office. But indeed, there's always going to be the old school legacy environment where nothing is going to change.
Yeah.
But there is a growing question, there's a growing demand of people that want to change. And it's not like Gartner claims somewhere in the cloud environment, because it's already into enterprise. I did a lot of work 5 to 6 years ago in enterprise environments in the Benelux, where we were integrating development and operations people in organizations where you really wouldn't expect it to happen. So it's definitely, culture is changing within those organizations. And I hope for you that either you realize what you just said and find something else, or...
The problem is that we address this problem since years to our bosses.
When are they going to retire?
Yeah. And they always say, yes, we need some change, but in reality nothing happens. Huh? The same procedure for new projects as years ago.
Well, I know that there's organizations in Belgium now that have put up a budget of 1.5 million euros just to refactor their complete infrastructure and to integrate development and operations. They set out really huge budgets to do that. There's going to be use cases about that, and maybe you can point your management to them. That's evolution, that's how stuff works. More questions?
Do you know whether there are serious plans to include something like libvirt support into Vagrant?
There's plans. Patrick promised me to have a test version available by June last year.
Great.
The thing is, having libvirt support in there, if you just take VirtualBox, it's up, down, local instance, and you don't talk over network stuff, you don't talk about adding storage, you don't talk about all these things. And once you start adding libvirt, it means you need to take care about with VirtualBox authentication, non-existing. It's you, local, root access, even not root access, you just access it. With libvirt, it means adding authentication, adding networking stuff, adding all those things. Patrick ran into another problem. He ran to the situation where he had to deploy more than virtual machines than he had available on his physical machine. And he basically, it's not really a fork, they're working together, but it's a different set of libraries, and it's called McCloud. And it's doing exactly the same as Vagrant, but on Amazon instances. So there's work with Gmas from Fog trying to work with Fog so they can actually talk to VMware and talk to the different clouds providers. So you'd have something which is Vagrant, but not Vagrant, but giving you the same features, but on remote machines. I'm not sure what the state of support for libvirt in Fog is currently, but it's an ongoing process. There's people working on it, but the libvirt support for Vagrant, it's hiding somewhere in a branch. I know there's some code that's supposed to be worked, but I think Patrick wants feedback for that, so I can look up where the branch is hiding and point you to it, but it's definitely not functional.
Some more questions? No more questions, so thanks to Kris.